Hi, let's get this finished up. When we left off, we were talking about Operation Verano in May of 1958, how Batista had ordered 12,000 troops to not only put down Castro and his forces, but to also put down any opposition groups. And you read about some of those opposition groups in Chapter 3 of Single Party States, which was this homework for this weekend. So, in launching 12,000 soldiers against these revolutionaries, it's going to backfire on Batista because the middle class is going to think this is a bit excessive, and they were becoming sympathetic towards Castro and the rebels because of the press they were getting both in Cuba and in the United States. And it'll also make the church more sympathetic to Castro's cause because, again, through this continued fighting for over 2.5, 3 years, innocent people are dying. And so this is just seen as, think of it like icing on the cake when Batista's trying to go all out for all opposition groups so he can stay in power. It actually also will lead some to join Castro. And in that one segment we watched with Rebels in the Mountains, Rebels in the Maestras, we saw that even some American young men, I mean, they're 15, 16 years old, had come to fight. And they just felt they had to make a difference and fight against oppression. And Castro had really done a good job of manipulating the media, the American media, to not only get people to come, but for people to help come and fight, but for people to keep sending their money. And a lot of times that was Cuban exiles who understood the tyranny and how tough Batista's regime was. And so by November of 58, Castro is going to have 3,000 troops. His forces will grow substantially. So this moves us on to our next point, the November elections, November of 1958. And to try and squash the movements that were against him and to please U.S. officials, Batista scheduled elections for November of 58, and he said he would not run. And he had a puppet run in his place. That puppet candidate, and it's on the slide there for you underneath number 5, is Andre Riviera Aguero. And of course, he is going to win, but the elections are rigged. But Batista really wanted to hold elections, really just to put on the show of trying to make concessions, especially for the United States, because the United States said, if you hold elections, we will resume sending aid to you and to you to support your programs. And so, of course, the puppet wins. It's a rigged election. Less than half the population shows up to vote. But again, that's a lot like elections here, unfortunately. And other candidates were bullied not to run. And still, it's too little too late. And by the end of 1958, Batista knows the end is near. And the end for Batista is this: by December of 1958, he knows that the rebels are close, and they were actually on the outskirts of Havana. And again, remember that Castro and his rebel followers were called Barbudos, Barbudos. Barbudos, it means bearded ones. So they're on the outskirts of Havana. It's like over 600 miles from Santiago. He's just been on this triumphal processional march towards, well, it wasn't a march, they were in cars, but just conquering and parading along, throughout all of the island of Cuba until he gets to northwestern Cuba, or more northern, but northwestern tip of Cuba where Havana is. And So by December of 58, the rebels are on the outskirts of Havana. Either the United States was no longer interested in helping Batista, or they were no longer interested in trying to fight off, trying to do things that would ward off or stop Castro. And on January 1st, 1958, Castro and rebel forces will reach the presidential palace in Havana and interrupt his New Year's celebrations. And Batista again knows the end is near, so he's going to flee with his family. Batista will flee with his family and close aides to the Dominican Republic and then to Miami. And this is also so Batista will be out. Batista will be gone, but there's still going to be people in place that were Batista supporters. And our next lecture will focus on what happens to them. They're basically executed. But I had posted the Ed Sullivan show interview. Ed Sullivan had went to Cuba and had interviewed Castro on January 11th, 1959. So by January 1st, excuse me, I think earlier I said January 1st, 1958. It would have been January 1st, 1959. It would have been December 31st that they had made their way from the outskirts of Havana to the presidential palace, and they interrupted their festivities on January 1st, 1959. And Batista is going to flee. 10 days later, January 11th, 1959, Ed Sullivan will interview Castro and really elevates him to, we're behind you. The media's behind you. You're like a modern day George Washington trying to liberate your people from tyranny. And our public really does fall for it. And Castro is going to use that to his advantage, and he'll go on a worldwide, he'll go to the United States. He actually went there years before on his honeymoon. He went to New York City. But again, if you read anything he writes, he talks about wanting to lash out against the United States and kick the United States out. In our further lectures, we're going to talk about how he will keep saying they're not communist, but then he is going to work with Khrushchev, and Khrushchev will buy Cuban exported sugar and send crude oil to Cuba. U.S. refineries in Cuba are not going to want to refine it, and this causes, this increases tension between Cuba and the United States. So Castro just nationalizes the refineries, and the United States basically is like, okay, we're going to be done with you. And so Castro is willing to let ballistic missiles, be housed in Cuba. And it leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which you read about. And I'm going to give you some more notes over that later. But, Castro's going to get this idea that he can just go with this all-out war of attrition, and he doesn't really care. It's almost like he doesn't care if Cuba is lost in the process. So Khrushchev's kind of like, whoa, back up. And the Soviet Union's a major power at this time in the 60s. And so pretty soon the Soviet Union and Castro will break ties. And that's going to be a sore spot. And Castro will operate independently as a communist leader and run Cuba as a communist country. So we will continue on with this. Again, make sure you have these notes in your binder, and see you soon.